Hi there, and welcome to the first ever Sussex Sport Weekly podcast, where we're going to talk about all things Sussex Sport. But this week, we're focusing purely on Brighton and Hove Albion and Crawley Town and the transfer window and what it means for the rest of their seasons. I'm here joined by Chief Football Writer Derren Howard, Frankie, Elliott, and Matt Pole, who are football writers. Frankie's been focusing mainly on the Brighton stuff this week, whereas Matt has been looking at both Brighton and Crawley Town's action this week. So I'm going to start with you, Derren, and can you sum up Brighton's transfer window?
Yeah, the window. So the window obviously closed on Tuesday, and I think for most part, Brighton fans will be fairly happy with what happened. There were no major incomings. They signed the young playmaker from Argentina, Bonetti, and then also Yasin Ari from. He's a very talented Swedish midfielder. Whether they're players that would help De Zerbi in the second half of the season is yet to be seen. But I think the main thing Albion fans will be pleased about is that they managed to keep hold of Alexis McAllister and Moises Caicedo. Both players have been excellent for Brighton this season, and they're playing in the central midfield areas. They've been outstanding against some of the best players in the Premier League. I think a lot of people look at those as though they're Champions League quality players. And for Brighton to keep them this window, I think that's a successful transfer window for them, particularly with the interest that Chelsea and Arsenal shown. And to turn down 70 million bid, it was reported from Arsenal for Caicedo, really showed how much they wanted to keep him. Remember, he's a player that Brighton signed for just around about 4 million, 18 months ago. So that would have been a huge profit. But yeah, keeping those was big. Leandro Trossard left. But I think with the emergence of Kara Mitoma, that's a sign in a departure that they can deal with.
Yeah. Caicedo, 70 million. Frankie, is he really worth that much?
Well, back in October or September, I believe, Graham Potter was asked about the valuation of Caicedo, and he said it was 42 million for just one of his boots. So it's probably a little bit off if you're looking for the whole player. I'd say, look, I mean, the valuation of midfielders nowadays is crazy, and football players in general. Obviously, we've just seen the most expensive British transfer go to a midfielder that's played less than 100 career games. So when you take that into account and the evaluations around him, it's very difficult to work out if Caicedo is worth 70 million. When you look at it from that business standpoint, he's 21 years old. He's been one of the best centre mids in the Premier League this year. For a top club, you're investing in a player for at least 10 years. So it's a big investment. And like I say, for these clubs, especially clubs like Chelsea, and even to a certain extent Arsenal, 70 million is probably what they can afford nowadays, and are willing to pay for someone that is that young and that good. I think it's very admirable of Brighton to be holding out for such a large sum, because I think a lot of other clubs in the similar size bracket as Brighton would have probably crumbled at seeing 70 million and gone, well, we'll just cash in while we can. But I think they know what sort of player they've got on their hands, and the experience of selling big players in the past. This is, the last year we've seen their centre mid and their left back go for astronomical fees. So I think their experience in selling these high quality players and know how to get a good deal for the club and for the player as well. So I think overall, yes, I'd say he's probably worth that, and I think it's good of Brighton to hold out for until they get what they deserve really for him.
Yeah, but when you look at someone like Jorginho, who goes from Chelsea to Arsenal for 12 million, is Caicedo, I know he's a lot younger than Jorginho, but is he that much worth that much more than a Jorginho?
Well, that's the thing, is with the Jorginho, they've only bought him for 18 months at 31. And Jorginho offers a certain skill level. Like, obviously his ability to dictate play and pass the ball is exceptional. He can't run at all. He's not particularly physical. So Arsenal have invested really in somebody that is coming on to kill games for them to win the title. I would say they're buying a player that is helping them in the Europa League to make sure that Thomas Partey is resting, and also for somebody when games are tight, which they obviously do in title runnings, games are only one goal ahead with 20 minutes to go. This is still a very young Arsenal team. Having that experience coming in makes a big difference. Having said that, past this season, what is Jorginho's value to that team? It's hard to say. I mean, Chelsea fans, certainly, there was very much a love-hate relationship with him. So 12 million, I don't think anyone was particularly upset about it. With Caicedo, you've got someone that, again, like we've seen with Cucurella, it could be a very rocky start. He's still very, very young. He's still unproven at European level. So Arsenal, even if they bought him in January, it might have been a bit of a rocky road start, but they've got at least, like I say, 10 years until Jorginho's age. So that's a long time in football. So that's where that valuation comes in, I would say.
Yeah, fair enough. And Matt or Derren, whoever wants to pitch in, obviously the highest, the biggest departure was Leo Trossard. Are Brighton going to miss him?
I don't think they will. I think in the games that Mitoma has played, he's been absolutely electric. And the thing about Mitoma that I like, he is so direct. He loves running at defenders. He loves beating a man and then putting a cross in. And you saw the goal that he scored against the FA Cup against Liverpool. He can just produce a moment of magic out of nothing. So I think it just goes to show how good Brighton's overall recruitment is, that they can immediately bring in a player like that, and you kind of forget about a player who's been one of the mainstays and one of the shining lights for the club. So I don't think they'll end up missing out on him, to be honest. It might be a bit touch and go as injuries maybe, but in terms of impact on the starting 11, I don't think, and this is probably famous last words, they will probably miss him as much as many people think they will.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Matt. I think Trossard, he played a big role in helping Brighton to establish themselves in the Premier League, and there's no doubt about it. He's a classy player, and he'll probably go on to do well at Arsenal. But I think in the position that Brighton are in at the moment, Mitoma's just taken everybody by surprise. I heard Dunk talking after the match against Liverpool when Mitoma got the late goal that it's like he's just come out from nowhere. He's surprised. Like Brighton's recruitment team obviously did their research and their background on him, but even from a player's perspective, like the fellow Brighton players are like, my word, they just didn't think he would have the impact that he has. And I think with him coming in, it's allowed Trossard moving on is a perfect time for Brighton, because it allows Mitoma a free run into the team.
Absolutely.
It's just a shame that it ended on a sour note, actually, with Trossard, because there was all of the falling out with De Zerbi, and then with the agent accusing De Zerbi of humiliating Trossard. And it was a bit of a shame it had to sort of end on a sour note, because he has been a great player for Brighton. And but yeah, it's I think it's a good move all round, to be honest. A decent fee, and Brighton certainly have a replacement.
You've also got to remember as well, sorry, just to add to that when Mitoma was signed, no one knew, not even the players knew who he was. So it's not, obviously fans sometimes can be a bit caught out, but Mitoma wasn't even known to his own teammates. So it's it's an amazing thing, but it's almost a complete luck of the draw, because to have someone, like we said, we've seen this window, players being signed for astronomical fees for well-known names. Will they come close to being what Mitoma is? Who knows? Do you know what I mean? For Mitoma to get into the first team and to be one of the best wingers in the Premier League right now, it's a crazy story. It's a really, really crazy story.
Absolutely.
It's similar with, sorry, Mark.
That's
I was
all
just
right.
going to say, it's similar with Caicedo. When he came in, fans were really, when Basuma was going to go, he had been such a mainstay in that Brighton midfield, and Caicedo's arrived, and Basuma's hardly been missed at all. He's actually struggled at Tottenham, while Brighton have arguably produced another player for a fraction of the fee that they received for Basuma for Caicedo.
Yeah, absolutely. And Frankie, I know you've written a story for sussexworld.co.uk, but can you talk through what problems Brighton didn't solve during the transfer window?
Well, there is still the slight issue, which is not really, no one knows the truth about whether Caicedo actually did want to stay or not. So there was the statement he released on the Friday after Arsenal's second bid, where he wrote on Instagram, his account wrote on Instagram that he wanted to leave, and he was pleading to leave. A lot of people picked up that it was unlikely to have been him, because he signed for his new agent company early that week, one of the biggest agencies in South America. A lot of people believe that it was a very agent-driven plea for the move, because in the post his hometown was spelt wrong, which would have been unlikely to have been the case if he had written himself. So there was a lot of talk about whether, well, does he actually want to leave? Does he not? Is he actually okay? If he did want to leave, like a lot of people believe, is he going to be focused for the rest of the season? Because as Derren said earlier, he's probably been Brighton's most important player alongside McAllister. If you've got a player that doesn't want to be there anymore, does that lead to him playing as well? If not, then does this derails Brighton's season? And they don't really have the ability, unlike with Trossard, to drop him, because in dropping him and his replacement in Billy Gilmore, is still a good player, but you wouldn't say it's the same with the Matoma thing. It's like, oh, it's okay, we've got Matoma who is as good, if not better. So that's an issue that could derail the season, but that's, that also could be fine. The major issue in terms of a lack of cover or players is in the left centre back position. It's an issue that's sort of never really been addressed since Dan Burn was sold last January, but it's obviously really reared its head because Adam Webster's having who was a regular left centre-back partner to Lewis Dunk, who plays on the right. Webster's having a few injury problems since the warm winter training in Dubai. He picked up an injury there and has never seemed to really get back to full fitness since. His replacement there was Levi Colwill, who was doing brilliantly. De Zerbi is a big fan and was playing brilliantly in games against Liverpool and against Arsenal in the Carabao Cup and things like that. So that seems to be okay as well. But he's obviously now just picked up an injury that keeps him out for 4 to 6 weeks. There was a number of players linked with that De Zerbi was wanting to fill that slot in the January window. None of those deals came about. He did say on Friday he was happy with his squad at the moment. He wasn't looking to sign anyone, but on Sunday following the Liverpool game, he made comments about the fact that if they wanted to challenge for Europe, they would need a stronger squad. So it's unclear about whether he is actually happy or whether he is just keeping face in front of the media. But that would, again, it's funny because there's always a team from most Premier League seasons that is challenging the big six. You see your West Hams, Wolves, Southampton have been there in the past with really good teams that have a very good first 11. What normally derails their chances from getting into Champions League football is when the crunch games come in with the last 10 games to go. That's when the legs can falter and the pressure can get to players, and not having that quality to come off the bench means they can lose games that they would have been winning earlier in the season. That would be Brighton's biggest test, and for certainly not fulfilling a replacement in the defensive position, which is so important to De Zerbi's football because all of the attacking play starts from the centre-backs. Not having good enough cover for those games, for the run-in, so to speak, might affect their chances of playing European football next year. Yeah.
Can they still make Europe back?
I don't know is the boring answer to that, I'm afraid. I mean, you would have to assume that Chelsea, with the amount of money that they've spent, will have to come good in the second half of the season. Liverpool is a difficult one for me to assess how well they're going to go. They've not really recruited in January. They brought in Cody Gakpo, but I think most people can see that they haven't really replaced Sadio Mane, and their midfield, just looking at it, it just seems a bit all over the shop. So I think they do have it in them to finish in Europe, but I have a feeling that the bigger clubs will eventually come good, and especially using the example of Chelsea, they've just spent £105 million on a player who's only been in Europe since August, amongst a host of other players as well this January. So I think that they have it in them to do it, but I think this season might be a season too early for them. But then again, the worry is they're having such a good season. You worry for them in the summer with players like Alexis McAllister, Caicedo, Mitoma. They will all attract big clubs and the attention. So I think if this is the season, if any season is they're going to be where they need to get into Europe, it will have to be this one, because I think this will be the best opportunity to do it. But at the same time, there's still the FA Cup. They might end up winning that and getting into Europa League. I'm going to be pessimistic and say I still don't think Brighton will. It'll be close, but I don't think Brighton will get into Europe this season.
Darren?
Yeah, I think they've got a chance, but like Matt says, the other teams that they've spent large amounts of money, and if they can gel their players fairly quickly, then they are going to be strong towards the end of the season. I just think Brighton's squad's maybe a little bit light, and also it seems funny to say with Evan Ferguson, but just an injury to him. He picked up a nasty injury against Liverpool, and he's been
How that wasn't a red card, I will never know. Shocking, wasn't it?
Yeah. It's one that's picked up, and it depends how long he's out for. And it seems silly to say that European hopes would rest on an 18-year-old who's only played a few matches, but he's made a bigger impact, and he gives Brighton quite a focal point, and he's very mobile and intelligent player for his age as well. And I think they'll miss him if he's out for 5 or 6 matches. That could be a miss. I just think their squad may be a little bit too light to get into Europe this year, and that's one of the frustrations with the transfer window. Maybe if they had have just not so much gambled a bit, but because that's not Brighton's way of doing things. They have a clear strategy that they go for. But if they had have made just a couple of, maybe in central midfield, and as Frankie said, the left-sided centre-back as well, just to give them that extra boost for the second half of the season, then they may. But they're still in there with a shout. So I certainly wouldn't rule them out.
Yeah. And while Matt mentioned the other team strengthened there, I'm just going to ask you all what was the sort of big transfer that caught your eye in this transfer window, not including any Brighton stuff. So Frankie.
The Murdic, the Chelsea Ukrainian left wing. I think that was the most interesting to me because, as Derren just said, Brighton have very much had a plan and have been very much a calculated team that don't take any risks since they moved up to the Premier League. Whereas with Chelsea, it seems very much they just throw money at anyone that is linked with another big club. So it's an interesting one. He was Arsenal's top target for since last summer. Was basically going to be going there this January. Chelsea swooped in the last minute to sign him at a very astronomical fee of like 88.5 million. He looks brilliant from the 15-20 minutes he came on at Anfield. He looks like he is the real deal. But it just will be interesting to see how it works because, as we've just discussed, Chelsea have signed a crazy amount of players in both the summer and January and already have a load of players in that wide area position. But they have now signed one of the most expensive players of all time there as well. So to watch how that unfolds and see if he will flourish at Chelsea or regret not going to Arsenal will be very interesting.
Yeah, Matt.
I'm going to go for Sabitzer at United. It's been very rare in the post-Ferguson years for United to actually make signings that make sense. And off the back of Eriksen getting injured, they needed a midfielder. And they made the Carabao Cup final, but they're still in the Europa League, the FA Cup. I suppose you can make a claim that they're challenging for the Premier League. And at the moment, their midfield doesn't have the strength and depth there. But what they've done is they've brought in a player who's got experience of playing in the Champions League. He's been a mainstay of the Austrian national team for, well, God knows how long. And he is a more or less a like-for-like replacement for Eriksen. I think Eriksen is probably better in terms of distribution, but Sabitzer is a better box-to-box midfielder. And getting him on a loan with no obligation to buy, I think they can't lose, really, United, unless he gets a horrific injury. So, yeah, for me, I'd probably say Sabitzer at United.
Lovely. Derren?
Yeah, well, I've enjoyed watching Nottingham Forest since they've come back up into the Premier League. Some of their business has been crazy this year. But I'd say for signings, I just think the 2 signings that Arsenal have made, there's been some big fees Chelsea have paid as well, but I just think the 2 signings that Arsenal made in Trossard and Jorginho will get them over the line. I think they're really key players. To get Jorginho, he'll help them this season more than what maybe Caicedo would. Caicedo would be a long-term signing for Arsenal, but I just think Jorginho will give them that experience they need in the short term, and Trossard will be a very good impact substitution for them as well to complement Nketiah, who's really been, he's been excellent, I think, since the injury to Jesus as well. So I think the 2 signings Arsenal have made will potentially seal the title for them or help them towards it anyway.
Yeah. Well, I'm not interested whatsoever in the Premier League because I live and breathe League 2 each week with Crawley Town, and they've had an interesting season. I haven't got time to go through it all now, but since their new owners came in, Wagme United, it's all been a bit of a roller coaster, to say the least, I think. And the transfer window, I don't think it was quite what the Crawley Town fans were hoping for. They signed 6 players, but got rid of 8 players, including 2 of their more experienced, Jake Hessentyler and George Frankham. Matt, what did you make of Crawley Town's transfer window?
I think, as you touched upon there, getting rid of so many senior players is going to be a massive issue. The lads that they've brought in, I think the oldest is probably about 23. I might be wrong there, but I think that Crawley fans would like to see a few more experienced heads who know the league, and especially considering I would say, precarious position they're in, especially if Saturday's game at Gillingham doesn't go their way, they are in deep trouble. I think what they need is like a player in the mould of a Joel Lynch, who is a leader. He can kind of bring the young lads on, a cool head. Because I think the problem they had at the start of the season under Betsy was it's all very well and good bringing in loan players from like Arsenal and who else they have? I think
Balagizi from Liverpool.
But you bring in 1 or 2 of them. You don't hang your hat on 4 or 5 of them. You want 2 of them to be complemented by older players that can mould them and bring them on as players and bring them into the team. So I think looking at the players that Crawley have brought in, I'd probably give it a generous 6 out of 10. I think the goalkeeper they bought, Ryan Schofield, I think he's a bit of a coup. He's played a surprising amount of games for Huddersfield Town in the Championship. And I am predicting that he will probably be up there with Ellery Balcombe as quite a good signing for him. But without meaning to knock it, players like Jack Rolls, you look at them and they've only really done it in the National League. And as a Crawley fan, you wonder, well, if he's done it in the National League, but what Football League experience does he have? Same as players like buying a backup goalkeeper, you kind of think, couldn't that not have been used elsewhere? So it's difficult. I think, it could have gone better, but at the same time, it could have gone worse. I said I'd give it a 6 out of 10 because it's not particularly eye-catching, but it's, I suppose, putting it optimistically, it's better than not buying anyone at all, I suppose, after all the players that have left. So I say the proof will be in the pudding come the end of the season, whether or not they're still a Football League club.
Absolutely. And you referenced the game this Saturday, Gillingham. It's a huge game. It's going to be a sellout crowd. So the Priestfield is going to be rocking on Saturday, I think. And obviously they're going to be facing Tom Nichols, who the fans still hold massive grudge for Wagme letting them go, and Glenn Morris as well. So going to be interesting. I mean, Frankie and Derren, have you been watching Crawley Town from a distance?
I just think bringing in I'm not bringing in Scott Lindsay. I just think it's a really good move. He seems to be a manager that the players are going to respect, and they just seem to have lacked so much direction on and off the pitch. It just seems to be all over the show, and I think this guy, he's got a good track record, and he's a manager that the players you'd think would look at and respect. And I think he's going to be the most important arrival out of the window. I think he hopefully he can steady it and get them at least a solid basis to keep them in the league, and then hopefully they can push on next season.
Going back to Derren's point, mentioning Scott Lindsay there, I think the difference between Scott Lindsay and Matthew Wetherington and Kevin Betsy is that it's going to sound like an odd thing to say, but Scott Lindsay is an actual coach. And I know that people at the game on Saturday against Salford said it actually looked like a team who had been coached by someone who had that knowledge of senior level football. So as Derren said, Scott Lindsay, I think, is an absolutely brilliant, probably the best signing Wagme have made since their time here. And I think, again, predicting that I think they should be upwardly mobile under Scott Lindsay. But again, a lot rests on Saturday's game at Gillingham. Yeah.
And Frankie, what are your views on Crawley Town this season?
I haven't been following it as closely, other than I saw obviously the whole debacle with Matthew Everington. But yeah, no, it seems to have been a bit of a car crash from August onwards. But yeah, I mean, I have to start. The important thing is now is getting in as an experienced Football League manager, and I have to say, when you're in the sort of League One, League Two, from February on to the end of the season is a long way to go. Clubs can fall, clubs can rise. So with a more settled regimen in place, that will help Crawley an awful lot, I do believe, because I've been there as a Bristol Rovers fan when you'd be sitting there looking okay in sort of 12th, 13th, and then not enough was done in January, or a manager was kept on that shouldn't have been, and all of a sudden you find yourself with 5 games to go, staring, looking behind you, within danger of being relegated. And likewise, I've been in situations where going into January or coming out of January, we've been in the relegation zone, and a couple of 1 or 2 signings or a change of manager has meant you end up finishing 12th, 13th, 14th. So it's still in the Premier League, it doesn't feel as long, but in the Football League, there's these months, they can really make or break your season much more so than before Christmas.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Right. So we'll look at this weekend's games quickly. Derren, Brighton have got Bournemouth. Score prediction.
Well, Bournemouth have added a few players, haven't they, in the window? Yeah, I would go for a win. And as I said, if Evan Ferguson is missing, that will be a blow for Brighton. But 2-0 Brighton.
Fair enough, Frankie.
Yeah, it's funny. This is a really interesting period for Brighton because they've got a run of games now, which theoretically they are now favourites for. De Zerbi has really much enjoyed playing against. I believe he really enjoys playing against the Big Six. He's got some very good results against the Big Six, and they've played well against Big Six. I think Brighton have famously struggled against these sort of teams that they should be beating, and De Zerbi himself has found it fairly difficult as well, although he has picked up some very impressive victories. So it's going to be interesting to see. Bournemouth have also signed a centre-back as well for 24 million, so they've done what Brighton didn't do. But you would believe they've got more, the way they are playing against a really struggling Bournemouth side, that a 2-0 victory should take place. But, like I say, you never know. Yeah,
Matt?
Yeah, I'll have to agree with everything Frankie said there, and I'm even going to agree with the scoreline. I'm going to go for 2-0 Albion.
Fair enough. And yeah, I'll finish a full set. 2-0 Albion. And Crawley Town, like we said, they're away at Gillingham. Gillingham are below them in the league, but they are slowly catching. They've done some really good business during January. Matt, what do you think on this one?
Yeah, you don't want it to see it as a make or break game, but you do worry for Crawley if they don't pick up 3 points here. As you alluded to, Gillingham have done excellent business. Obviously, Tom Nichols, Glenn Morris among them. I'm going to go for a 2-0 Crawley Town win with a Tom Nichols and Glenn Morris own goals is what I'm going for.
Darren?
Yeah, I think the improvement under Lindsay will continue. I think they'll grind out. It'll be a real grind, but I think they'll may just sneak a 1-0 win.
And Frankie?
I'm going to really sit on the fence and go for a 1-1 draw.
Yeah, I think it will be a score draw, and I will put my house on Tom Nichols scoring with a header. So I think 1-1 or 2-2, but I think it will be a cracking game, and it will be an amazing atmosphere there. So thank you for listening, everyone, and thanks, Derren, Matt, and Frankie. You've been a really good discussion. You can see reports, reaction, photos, etc., from all the games of the weekend from on sussexworld.co.uk. So thanks again for listening, and join us next week to see reaction and previews for the next weekend's games.